You probably think you know what goes on inside a preschool classroom. The laughter, the finger painting, the story time. Tiny hands holding construction paper hearts, teachers with warm smiles, sunlight streaming through paper snowflakes taped to the windows. But that's not the full story. That's the version they want you to see, the version they post on the school's Instagram feed with captions like, "Learning through play," and "Every child is special." What they don't show you, what they can't show you, is how the system grinds people down. How it turns bright-eyed teachers into shadows. How it fails children in ways that are almost invisible, unless you know what to look for. I used to believe in it. I really did. I thought being a preschool teacher meant shaping young minds, nurturing growth, giving kids the kind of foundation that could change the entire trajectory of their lives. And maybe, in a different world, that could have been true. But in this world, in this system, it's not about the kids. It's not even about education. It's about control, image, compliance, and cutting corners wherever you can. There's a reason most teachers don't talk about what really happens inside those walls. Because if we did, no one would feel safe dropping their child off again. I remember the moment I realized I couldn't keep pretending. It wasn't dramatic. No screaming, no breakdown, no catastrophic event. It was just a moment, quiet, almost forgettable. A Tuesday afternoon, sticky with humidity, the smell of disinfectant still clinging to the air after we wiped down the nap mats. One of the kids, Ellie, had wet herself again. She was 4. But no one had told her parents that she hadn't made it through a single nap time dry in over 2 months. We weren't allowed to tell them. Because the director said it might create unnecessary concerns or lead to developmental labeling. So we'd just clean her up, again, change her outfit, throw the soiled clothes in a plastic bag, and pretend everything was fine. And when her mom picked her up and asked how her day was, we'd smile and say the same line we were trained to say. She had a great day. Lots of creative play and circle time. Ellie's eyes would flick up to me for half a second. She knew I was lying. She didn't understand why, but she knew. And in that moment, standing there, holding a plastic bag filled with urine-soaked pants, I felt something I didn't have words for at the time. Not just guilt. Not just sadness. Something heavier, like complicity. That was the beginning of the unraveling for me. You see, the public still sees this job as cute. Like we spend our days finger painting and singing songs. They don't see the 12-hour shifts with no lunch break. The constant surveillance, yes, cameras in the classrooms. The performance reviews based on parent satisfaction scores, not child outcomes. They don't hear the screaming, the biting, the choking, the way kids act out what they've seen at home when they think no one's watching. And we're not allowed to say anything. Not to the parents. Not to each other. Because talking about it would mean acknowledging that something's deeply wrong. We call it developmental delay. We say sensory processing. We throw around terms like attachment behavior and early intervention, like we're doing something. But really, most of the time, we're just putting out fires. And pretending the whole building isn't made of dry kindling. There's a reason so many of us leave. And yet, some of us stay too long. We stay because we think if we leave, who's left to protect the kids? But you can't protect them from a system designed to fail them. And once you start seeing the cracks, once you realize how much damage is being done in plain sight, you can't unsee it. Not when the 4-year-old flinches when you raise your voice. Not when you find bite marks on a toddler's back and you're told, it happens sometimes. Not when you notice that a child stops speaking entirely and no one seems concerned. I wish I could tell you that Ellie was the worst of it. That it was just one child, one incident, one moment of unease. But she was only the beginning. One thread in a much larger, darker fabric. This job didn't just break me. It showed me how many people walk through life trusting a system that barely holds together with masking tape and fake smiles. And the worst part? Most parents will never know. Because we're trained to keep it quiet. To say the right things. Smile the right way. Perform care like it's a script, instead of what it should be, a responsibility. But I'm done performing. There are things you need to know. Things no one told me before I stepped into that classroom. Things you deserve to know. So here it is. The truth, piece by piece. Starting now. I didn't become a preschool teacher by accident. I wasn't one of those people who just needed a paycheck and stumbled into childcare because it was convenient. This was what I wanted. I studied early childhood education. I interned, shadowed, volunteered at after-school programs. I read Piaget, Vygotsky, Montessori. I believed in scaffolding, emotional literacy, sensory exploration, all the buzzwords you'll hear on a school tour. I thought I understood what children needed. Structure, safety, support, space to explore. I thought that was the job. And in the beginning, when I walked into that classroom for the first time, fresh laminate floors, laminated charts, alphabet posters, bins of building blocks and plastic fruit, it looked like the kind of place where kids could thrive. The cubbies even had little name tags with stars and stickers. Mine did too. But it didn't take long before that image started to fade. Not because of anything loud or dramatic, not at first. It was quieter than that. More subtle. Like a constant low hum of discomfort you can't quite place. It started with the ratios. 8 toddlers to 1 adult. 12 preschoolers, sometimes more, if someone called out and we couldn't get a sub. Legally, that's allowed in most states. Barely. But when one child is screaming because they don't want to put their shoes on, and another is biting someone in the corner, and another just vomited on the play kitchen, and the rest are climbing, crying, pushing, hiding under tables, or soaking their pants because they're still not fully toilet trained, you start to understand how those numbers don't mean much in real life. There were days I couldn't even make eye contact with all my students, let alone notice if one of them was unusually quiet or withdrawn or bruised. It wasn't that I didn't care. I cared so much it physically hurt. But caring doesn't stop the clock. Caring doesn't give you extra hands or more hours in the day. And eventually, the gap between what I wanted to give them and what I could give them started to stretch so wide. I felt like I was being torn in half. There's this phrase you hear a lot in early childhood education, meeting children where they are. But what happens when you're not allowed to? When you're told to follow the lesson plan, even if half the kids are melting down? When you're rushing through art time because corporate wants photos for the newsletter? When a child is clearly dysregulated and needs sensory input or quiet time, but you're not permitted to let them leave the group because it sets a bad precedent? What do you call that? It's not education. It's choreography. We were taught to redirect behaviors instead of acknowledging pain. To use positive language even when things were clearly falling apart. To keep smiling, always smiling, because parents pick up at 5, and no one wants to see a teacher with tired eyes and clenched teeth. Do you know how often we cried in the storage closet? I'm not being metaphorical. There's an actual supply closet in every preschool I've worked at, small, dim, packed with bulk wipes and dried-out glue sticks, where we'd take turns going in, just to breathe. Just to cry for 30 seconds, wipe our faces, and come back out like nothing happened. You learn to do it fast. Because if you're gone too long, something might happen. And that's the other thing no one talks about, how dangerous it can be. Children don't understand boundaries yet. They don't always understand consequences. We had chairs thrown. Fighting that drew blood. Hair pulling so violent we had to separate kids physically, sometimes holding one trembling child with a hand behind our backs to block the blows from another. We weren't trained in trauma response. We weren't trained in de-escalation. We were trained in how to make bulletin boards and sing songs with hand motions. But we did it anyway. Because once you're in it, once you've bonded with these kids, you don't just walk away. Even when you should. You keep coming back. Even when the pay is less than what you made waiting tables in college. Even when your bladder aches because there's no one to cover your class so you can use the bathroom. Even when you find yourself staring blankly at your fridge at midnight, exhausted and empty, wondering if tomorrow will be better, and knowing it won't. I don't think people understand what happens to you when you're surrounded by that much need every day. The constant tugging, Miss Claire, look at me. Miss Claire, I need help. Miss Claire, he hit me. The physical contact, being pulled, clung to, sneezed on, vomited on. The emotional weight, because these aren't just kids, they're people. with histories, with trauma, with invisible burdens they carry in their tiny bodies. And yet, despite all that, we're expected to be calm, warm, patient, always regulated. Because if we aren't, we're bad teachers, unprofessional, not fit for the job. But what about the system that throws us into chaos and expects us to smile through it? What about the centers that cut corners, hiring underqualified staff to save money, ignoring safety concerns, pushing teachers to work double shifts without breaks? What about the children who come in with bruises and go home with none of their behaviors documented because management doesn't want to upset the parents and risk losing tuition? That's where the rot is. Not in the classroom. Not in the kids. It's in the layers above us. The directors. The franchise owners. The early childhood consultants who make six figures and haven't stepped into a classroom in 10 years. The ones who tell us we need more pictures for social while we're holding a shaking toddler who just peed themselves because no one was available to take them to the bathroom. And if you push back, you're not a team player. I started this job believing I could help, that I could matter. But I've learned that meaning nothing to the system doesn't mean you stop showing up. It means you start seeing clearly. And what I saw, well, that's what I'm going to tell you next. There's something you start to notice after a while when you've worked in enough preschools. It starts as a quiet pattern, barely visible. But once you see it, it's everywhere. So many kids are unraveling. And no one's asking why. We blame the screens, the sugar, the parents, the lack of discipline. We label them emotionally reactive, socially delayed, high needs, developmentally behind. We fill out charts and forms and incident reports as if we're doing something meaningful, as if naming the storm somehow makes it stop. But the truth is, we're overwhelmed. We're not fixing anything. We're barely holding the dam together. There were days when half my class would be crying at once. Not tantrums sobbing. Full-body meltdowns, guttural screams, throwing themselves to the floor, fists clenched, faces red, inconsolable. Some of these kids were 2 years old. Some were 5. They weren't bad. They weren't spoiled. They were flooded. Lost in a sea of emotions no one ever taught them to navigate. And we were expected to just manage it. Calm them. Redirect them. Without the time or space to actually understand what was happening underneath. The phrase we were told to use was, big feelings. It sounds sweet, doesn't it? Harmless. But it's not harmless when you're saying it 20 times a day to a child who is clearly falling apart inside. What no one tells you is that many of these kids are coming into preschool already carrying trauma. They've seen things, heard things, lived through things that you wouldn't expect a toddler to even comprehend, let alone survive. But there's no intake form for trauma. No, check this box if your child has experienced emotional neglect, domestic violence, food insecurity, or chronic stress in utero. Instead, we get vague paperwork. A smiling family at drop-off. Maybe a few allergies listed, or a note about picky eating. And then we meet the child. The one who hides under the table when a door slams. The one who flinches when you raise your hand to get something off a shelf. The one who tries to control every game, every activity, every social interaction, because chaos at home has taught them that the only safety is in control. And we're told to encourage sharing, to model gentle behavior, to avoid power struggles. But no one teaches us how to care for a 4-year-old with untreated PTSD. No one prepares you for the moment when a child whispers something terrifying into your ear during story time. Something that makes your stomach drop, your mind scramble for what to do next. And all you can do is smile, nod, and keep reading about the hungry caterpillar, because if you react, the other kids will notice. And you don't want that child to feel exposed. So you tuck it away. And later, you report it to the director, who nods solemnly, maybe fills out a form, maybe calls someone. But most of the time, nothing happens. Because unless there's a visible injury or a specific threat, the threshold for intervention is impossibly high. I remember one boy, Aiden, 3 years old, would scream if anyone touched him, even lightly, refused to sit on the rug during group time, would hurl toys across the room when another child came too close. The first week, we chalked it up to separation anxiety. By the third week, we were told to start documenting problem behaviors. He was eventually expelled. Yes, expelled from preschool. Because he was too disruptive and we weren't equipped to meet his needs. But the truth is, we weren't equipped because no one gave us the tools. No therapist. No social worker. Just overworked teachers with degrees and CPR certifications and a dwindling sense of hope. And the kids suffer for it. People forget, preschool is often the first system a child enters. Their first exposure to structure, to adults outside the family, to the idea of rules and routine and trust. So when that system fails them, when it doesn't know how to hold them, teach them, see them, it sends a message that will echo for years. You're too much. You're not good. You're not safe here. And that message? It buries itself deep. I've seen kids go from joyful to shut down in a matter of weeks. I've seen the light leave their eyes. I've seen them mimic the coldness of adults who couldn't handle them. And I've watched as we sanitized it all with language like emotional regulation goals and self-soothing strategies and behavior management. What we should be saying is, this child is suffering. But suffering doesn't fit neatly into curriculum checklists or quarterly assessments. So we ignore it. We document the behavior, not the why. We send home stickers and behavior charts, pretending that positive reinforcement will fix whatever's breaking inside a 4-year-old's heart. And the parents? Most of them have no idea. Because they only see the sanitized version. The happy newsletter photos. The polite daily reports. The carefully chosen phrases that walk a line between honesty and PR. They don't see us frantically scrubbing feces off the walls. They don't see the hallway where we hold screaming children so they don't hurt themselves. They don't hear the things these kids say when they think no one's really listening. And we carry that. All of it. Inside our bodies, our minds, our dreams. It's why so many teachers drink. Why we leave in the middle of the year without notice. Why some of us stop talking altogether, because if we started, we might never stop. I wanted to help kids. I still do. But I've learned that loving them isn't enough, not when the system they're placed into isn't built to hold their pain. And if you think this is as bad as it gets, you're wrong. Because the part that still haunts me is what happens when parents do find out the truth and choose to look away. That's what I'll tell you next. You think the hardest part of this job would be the children. The meltdowns, the accidents, the chaos. But it's not. It's the parents. Not all of them, of course. Some are kind, thoughtful, involved in the way you wish more people were. But others. There's a kind of denial that runs deep in certain parents. Not ignorance, denial. The kind where they do see the signs. They hear what we're saying. They notice the bruises, the regression, the fear. And they look away. Because acknowledging it would mean having to do something. And the truth is, a lot of people just want a place to put their child. Somewhere clean, safe-looking, with a good reputation and polished staff, somewhere that gives them a moment of peace so they can go to work, or sleep, or scroll their phone in silence. That's the transaction. A warm smile at drop-off, a paper with a list of activities, and the unspoken promise that nothing serious happened today. Even if it did. I once worked with a little boy named Levi. Sweet, smart, but volatile. He could flip from laughter to violence in seconds. Throwing chairs. Screaming obscenities he should never have known it for. Biting his own arm until it bruised. We tried everything, visual schedules, sensory breaks, fidget tools, one-on-one support when we had the staffing for it, which wasn't often. But none of it was enough. At pickup, I gently mentioned to his mother that we were seeing some escalating behaviors. She didn't even let me finish the sentence. He doesn't do that at home, she snapped. Her voice flat, her eyes tired in a way that made my stomach twist. Then she looked down at her phone and said, "We're late for soccer." And that was the end of it. No follow-up. No questions. Just deflection. You see that a lot, the absolute unwillingness to believe that their child might be struggling. Or that maybe, just maybe, their child isn't okay because they're not okay. But we're not allowed to say that. We have to dance around it, say things like, "He's having big feelings lately," or, "We're noticing some challenges with transitions." Because if we're too direct, parents complain. And when parents complain, we get written up. And if we get written up too many times, we're gone. That's the other part most people don't know. The customer is always right. In most centers, parents aren't just parents, they're clients. They pay thousands of dollars a month, and with that comes an unspoken expectation that their child will be treated like royalty, that the teachers will be flawless, and that no uncomfortable truths will ever be mentioned. We're expected to be caretakers, therapists, conflict mediators, curriculum developers, janitors, and emotional punching bags, all while keeping everyone happy. I once got called into the office because a parent complained I wasn't enthusiastic enough during drop-off. Her daughter had bitten 2 classmates that morning and smeared yogurt all over the bookshelf, but I was supposed to smile and chat like everything was normal. Because the performance matters more than the reality. And the pressure to keep up that performance, day after day, child after child, is suffocating. We don't get hazard pay. We don't get therapy. We don't even get real sick days, because if you're out, someone else gets dumped with your class, and that someone else might not even be trained. You think substitute teachers are rare in high schools? Try early childhood education. Sometimes they pull someone from the front desk, or a floating staff member who is supposed to be on their lunch break. We're not talking about qualified specialists here, we're talking about whoever's body is available to stand in the room and try not to let anyone die. And that's not an exaggeration. We've had children run out of buildings because the doors weren't properly secured. We've had allergic reactions where the EpiPen wasn't even on site. We've had kids left outside on the playground for 20 minutes because the teacher miscounted during transition. And every time it happens, there's a meeting. Someone apologizes. And then everything goes back to normal. Until the next time. And the parents? Most of them never find out. Because management has a vested interest in keeping everything quiet. They know that the image, the illusion, is what keeps the tuition rolling in. So we're told to minimize, reframe, reassure. I've been instructed to say, your child had a rough moment during playtime, when the truth was that he choked another child with a jump rope. I've been told to write, a minor toileting accident, when a child had diarrhea down their legs and we didn't have enough extra clothes to fully change them. It's not about lying. It's about managing perception. And perception is everything. I used to think that if I just cared enough, if I just worked hard enough, I could rise above it. That somehow, the system would recognize that I was different. That I was there for the right reasons. But the system doesn't care about reasons. It cares about liability. About funding. About parent reviews and enrollment numbers and photos for the Facebook page. I remember a teacher, Jessica, who got fired for yelling. Not even yelling at a child, just raising her voice during a meltdown to stop one kid from hurting another. She'd been there for 6 years. The kids loved her. But someone heard her through the wall, and that was that. No investigation. No conversation. Just, you're not a good fit anymore. Meanwhile, the teacher who ignored a child's repeated disclosure of sexual abuse? She's still there. Because the parents never found out, and the center didn't want the legal risk of a formal report. That's when it really hit me. This isn't about children. It's not even about teaching. It's about keeping the parents just happy enough to keep paying. And keeping the teachers just scared enough to stay quiet. But I'm not quiet anymore. Because there's one thing I haven't told you yet. What happens when a child breaks down completely right in front of you? When the system pushes them too far, and you realize there's nothing you can do to stop it. That's next. It was late October when it happened. The air outside had finally turned cold enough for jackets, and the morning smelled faintly of wet leaves and disinfectant. We were doing our usual morning routine, weather song, calendar, snack, centers. Everything looked normal on the outside, but I knew something was off with Lucas the moment he walked through the door. He was usually the first to greet me, always grinning, always bouncing. But that morning he was quiet. He clung to his backpack like it was a lifeline. His face was pale, his mouth tense, like he was trying not to cry. When I bent down and asked if he was okay, he didn't speak. He just looked at me and shook his head. Once, I wish I had stopped everything right then. I wish I had taken him somewhere quiet, sat with him, just been with him. But the room was already in motion, toddlers spilling out blocks, someone crying because a crayon broke, the front desk buzzing on the intercom about a missing lunchbox. So I told him, gently, "Why don't you find your spot on the rug?" And I smiled. That fake, overpracticed preschool teacher smile we all learn. The one we wear like a mask. And he nodded and walked to his square of carpet. An hour later, he snapped. It was during cleanup. Someone had taken the yellow dump truck, the one he always played with. And in that moment, it was like something inside him shattered. He started screaming. Not yelling, screaming. From the chest, raw and violent. A sound that froze the room. He grabbed the nearest basket of wooden blocks and hurled it across the floor. Then he pushed another child. Hard. She hit the shelf and burst into tears. By the time I reached him, Lucas had kicked over the sensory table and was now throwing handfuls of rice into the air, crying so hard he was gagging. I knelt down and tried to touch his arm. He slapped my hand away. I tried to speak calmly. He screamed louder. Other kids were crying now. One had run to the corner and covered his ears. Another was standing perfectly still, frozen in place, eyes wide. The room was chaos. I managed to get Lucas into the calm corner, a small, padded nook we'd made with pillows and a weighted blanket. But he didn't calm down. He thrashed. He clawed at the walls. He pulled his own hair and slammed his forehead against the floor until I had to physically hold him down to stop him from hurting himself. And as I held the shaking, sobbing child, sweating, crying, snot smeared across his cheeks, I realized something. I had no idea what I was doing. And no one else did either. There was no mental health professional on site. No trauma-informed counselor. No emergency protocol beyond. Write up an incident report and call the parents. And that's exactly what we did. We wrote it up. We called his mom. We told her, calmly, professionally, that Lucas had a very hard day and that we'd love to have a conversation about some additional support strategies. She didn't ask what happened. She just sighed, like she'd heard it all before, and said she'd talk to him at home. That was it. The next day, Lucas didn't come back. The day after that, either. A week later, we were told he was unenrolled for personal reasons. No meeting, no support, no plan. He just disappeared. And that's how it happens more often than anyone realizes. A child breaks down, and the system just moves on. There's no safety net. No red flag that triggers a mandatory mental health check. No therapist who swoops in to help the family. No real accountability for what went wrong or what's going to happen to that child next. He could end up in another center, one with even less structure. He could stay home, isolated, labeled difficult. He could fall through the cracks because once you've been kicked out of preschool, it follows you. Yes, that's a real thing. Expulsions in early childhood education are more common than most people realize, especially for boys. Especially for Black and brown children. Especially when teachers are unsupported, overwhelmed, and working in a system that prioritizes compliance over care. And yet, we're told to call it challenging behavior. As if that's all it is. As if that child wasn't screaming from something deeper. Fear, hunger, shame, maybe something worse. I'll never forget the way Lucas looked at me during that meltdown. Not angry, not wild, terrified. Like something inside him had slipped out and he didn't know how to put it back. And all I could do was hold him down and pretend I had control. After he was unenrolled, we had to rearrange the classroom layout. One of the directors said it was for better flow, but we all knew why. The rice table was gone. The calm corner got new pillows. The dump truck was quietly put away. We erased him. That's what we do when a child doesn't fit. We find a way to erase the mess they left behind. It's easier than facing the truth. That a child came into our care and we failed them. Not because we didn't try, but because trying doesn't matter when the structure itself is broken. When there are no resources, no training, no real backup. Just a rotating cast of burnout teachers doing their best to survive the day. I still think about Lucas. About what might have happened if someone, anyone, had stepped in with real help. Not a sticker chart. Not a phone call. Help. But that's not what we're built for. Not in this country. Not in the system. And the longer I stayed in that room, the more I started to realize. Lucas wasn't the exception. He was the warning. And we ignored it. Because pretending everything's fine is easier than admitting how many children are falling apart under our watch. And if that's not haunting, I don't know what is. People like to talk about burnout in education like it's some vague, emotional fog. Like it just happens, the way a battery dies or a car runs out of gas. It's not sudden. It's not even dramatic. It's slow. Painfully, methodically slow. At first, it was little things, forgetting to drink water until afternoon, snapping at my partner over nothing, sleeping in my clothes because I was too tired to move. Then it became bigger things. Waking up with a pit in my stomach so heavy I couldn't breathe. The hardest part wasn't the exhaustion. It wasn't even the chaos. It was what the job did too. Because I didn't stop caring. That would have been easier. I kept caring too much. Caring until it physically hurt. They noticed, you know. The kids always notice. And yet we're told, explicitly or otherwise, not to show it. Not to let them see us feel. Because children take on your emotions. Because you need to be the calm in the storm. But when the storm never ends, where does that calm come from? I remember one afternoon, quiet time. The lights were dimmed, the soft instrumental music was playing, and the kids were on their mats. Some were asleep. Others fidgeted quietly, clutching stuffed animals or chewing on corners of blankets. I was sitting on the floor, back against the bookshelf, pretending to sort markers. And suddenly, without thinking, I started crying. Not loudly. Not dramatically. Just a slow, steady stream of tears down my face. I didn't even notice right away. But one of the kids did. Her name was Raya. She got up from her mat, walked over and sat next to me. Didn't say a word. Just leaned her head against my arm and held it there. She was 3 years old. And I remember thinking, what does it mean when a toddler is more emotionally attuned than the entire structure around her? What does it say about a system where the teachers are drowning and the children are the ones reaching out? But of course, I couldn't tell anyone about that moment. Couldn't include it in my daily report or log it in the classroom app. There's no checkbox for broke down quietly while pretending to organize supplies. And I definitely couldn't say anything during our team meetings. Because those were always about numbers. Enrollment. Incidents. Transitions. The language of the business. Yes, business. Because that's what early childhood education has become. Not a public service. Not a calling. A marketplace. I once sat in a training where we were told word for word. Parents don't want to hear about problems. They want to hear solutions. Not solutions for their children, mind you. Solutions for our image. We were told to phrase everything with a positive spin. So instead of saying, your child hit another student, we'd say, we had a tough moment learning about personal space. Instead of, your child refused to eat lunch, we'd say, we're continuing to explore new textures. It sounds laughable now. But it wasn't funny then. Because that kind of language wasn't meant to protect the kids, it was meant to protect the brand. We were selling reassurance. Security. Warmth. A fantasy. Meanwhile, behind the scenes, we were rationing snacks because our supply order hadn't come in. We were washing the same 3 spare shirts in the break room sink because too many kids had accidents and there weren't enough changes of clothes. We were scraping dried feces off the underside of chairs because one child, already labeled behavioral, had developed a habit of smearing. And we weren't allowed to tell the truth. Because the truth was bad for morale. Because the truth might trigger a licensing inspection. Because the truth might make someone pull their tuition, and in this world, tuition is everything. You want to know something else we weren't supposed to talk about? Turnover. At one center I worked at, our entire lead teacher team changed 3 times in a single school year. 3. That's not uncommon. The average early childhood educator stays in their role less than 2 years. And the newer hires? They're often high school grads with minimal training, brought in fast and cheap just to keep ratios legal. I've trained people who had never changed a diaper before. People who didn't know you can't leave toddlers unattended near a door that opens to a parking lot. People who were clearly there for the paycheck and nothing else, but got hired anyway because we were desperate. And guess who has to pick up the slack when they inevitably quit or get fired? Us. The ones still standing. The ones who care too much and get hurt for it. So we stop talking. Stop asking for help. Stop reporting things we know won't change. That's how we disappear piece by piece. And the thing is, when you burn out in a job like this, it's not just your body that goes. It's your ability to feel joy around children. To laugh when they do something silly. To connect without flinching at the thought of how much it will hurt when they leave, or change, or break down right in front of you. And that loss, that numbness, is the quietest tragedy of all. Because by the time we finally walk away, most of us don't even recognize ourselves anymore. But I stayed longer than I should have. Long enough to witness something I'll never forget, something that made me question not just the system, but myself. That's what I'll tell you next. There's a moment in this job, if you stay long enough, where you stop asking, what's wrong with the system? And start asking, what's wrong with me? I didn't notice when the shift happened. Didn't wake up one morning thinking, today I'll stop being the kind of teacher I wanted to be. It just crept in. Tiny compromises, day after day. Until one afternoon, I did something I'll never forgive myself for. It was near the end of a long, brittle week. Too many staff out. Too many incident reports. One of our newer assistants had quit mid-shift, just walked out during snack time and never came back. I was left alone with 14 kids and management just said, "We're trying to get coverage," like that meant anything. So I did what I always did, kept going. But that day, something was different. I was tired in a way that wasn't just physical. I was done. And then came Mason. Mason was 4. Bright. Hyperverbal. But he had what they called impulse control issues. What that really meant was he couldn't stop himself from pushing, grabbing, yelling, breaking. And he knew it upset us. Sometimes I think he needed it to upset us, just to feel something real from an adult. He was always testing limits, pulling scissors from the supply caddy, locking himself in the bathroom, knocking over other kids' block towers for no reason, and then laughing when they cried. Normally, I could handle it. But that day, I was empty. He had taken another child's toy and was refusing to give it back. When I crouched beside him and asked him to hand it over, he screamed in my face. Not just a loud, no, a full force, throat-shredding scream an inch from my ear. And I snapped. I didn't yell. I didn't hit him. But I grabbed his wrist hard. Not hard enough to bruise, but hard enough to scare him. Hard enough that his face changed instantly, mouth open, eyes wide, like he didn't recognize me. And I leaned in, and I said quietly, too quietly for the other kids to hear, "Enough. Sit down. Now." He sat. Not because he wanted to. Because he was afraid. And I walked away. I walked into the kitchen, ran cold water over my hands, and stood there for a full minute, heart pounding. That was the moment. The moment I realized something inside me had shifted. I had always told myself I'd never be that teacher. The one who uses fear. The one who loses control. But I had. Not because I was cruel. Not because I didn't care. Because I was alone. Because I was unsupported. Because I was exhausted to the marrow of my bones and no one was coming to help. And the scariest part? No one noticed. There were cameras in the room, yes. But no one checked them unless there was a parent complaint. And Mason didn't say anything. He just avoided me for the rest of the day, wouldn't meet my eyes, wouldn't come near me during pickup. His mom smiled when she arrived, complimented our Halloween window display, asked if Mason had eaten his lunch. I smiled back and said he had a good day. And that night, I didn't sleep. Because I had crossed a line. Not just with Mason, but with myself. I had become part of the system that fails kids in 1,000 tiny ways. And the next day, I went back to work. Because that's what we do. We normalize the damage. We justify it. We tell ourselves, it was just one moment. I'll do better next time. But the truth is, next time comes faster than you think. And if you're still alone, still unsupported, still silently unraveling in the background, it gets harder to come back from it. And then there's the shame. Not just guilt. Shame. Because I knew better. I knew Mason was acting out because something at home wasn't right. He'd started coming in with the same hoodie 3 days in a row. He'd started hoarding crackers from snack time, stuffing them in his backpack when he thought no one was looking. Those are signs. Anyone in early childhood knows the signs. But we're not allowed to ask. We're not allowed to dig. And even if we did, what would we do with the answers? We weren't trained for that. We were trained to sing "Wheels on the Bus" with enthusiasm and redirect with a gentle tone. We were trained to decorate bulletin boards, not investigate neglect. So we fail them. Over and over. Quietly. Painlessly. Efficiently. And then we document it as challenging behavior and move on. It's easier that way. Cleaner. More palatable for licensing and newsletters and parent-teacher conferences. But deep down, we all know that we're losing kids. And that we're losing ourselves. I stayed at that center for another 6 months. 6 months of smiling through gritted teeth. Of moments like that one with Mason, moments that felt small on the outside, but split me open on the inside. And every time it happened, I wondered, when did this become normal? How many of us are walking around, carrying moments like this? And if this is what early childhood looks like now, what does that mean for the children we're raising? What happens to a generation that grows up being quietly failed by the very people who were supposed to protect them? I think I already know the answer. And if you don't, I'll show you. Next, you don't always realize when you've reached your limit. Sometimes you think you're just tired. Maybe you're just in a rough patch, a hard week, a bad month. You tell yourself to push through. That you're still helping. That the good outweighs the bad. Until something happens that strips away the last of that illusion. And shows you, without question, that you've stayed too long. For me, it wasn't a child that finally broke me. It was another teacher. Her name was Alina. She was new. Quiet. Barely 22. She'd just finished her certification and talked constantly about sensory bins and gross motor development and how she wanted to go back for her master's someday. She reminded me of myself, before the edges wore down. Before the panic attacks and the silence and the sense that nothing I did mattered anymore. She was assigned to our pre-K room. 20 children. 1 assistant. And Alina. From day one, she tried. She arrived early. Stayed late. Made her own materials at home. Little laminated emotion cards, homemade Play-Doh, scavenger hunts. She used her own money for books. And when a child hit her on her 3rd day, she didn't flinch. She just crouched down and said, "I see you're really upset right now. I'm here to help." But it didn't matter. Because the room was too full. The children were too dysregulated. The administration was too focused on parent reviews and cost efficiency to give her what she actually needed: support. Within 2 weeks, I could see the cracks forming. She stopped wearing earrings. Stopped bringing lunch. Her smiles got thinner. Her voice more strained. I offered to help. I covered her room during lunch. I wrote her lesson plans when she couldn't think straight. But I knew where it was heading. We'd all been there. That slope from, "I'm just overwhelmed," to, "I can't do this," is short and steep. Then came the day I'll never forget. It was a Tuesday, cold and gray, the kind of day where everything feels heavier. I was walking past her room after drop-off when I heard it. Not yelling. Not crying. Silence. And if you've ever worked in a preschool, you know, silence is never good. I opened the door. There were 20 kids in the room, scattered in every direction, playing, wandering, bickering. And Alina? She was sitting in the reading corner. Legs pulled up. Hands over her face. Just sitting there. I walked over slowly. Knelt down. Whispered, "Are you okay?" She didn't move. Didn't even look at me. And then she whispered, "I can't hear them anymore. I can see them, but I can't hear anything." I froze. It took me a second to realize what she meant. She was dissociating. Right there. In the middle of a room full of children. I took her hand. It was ice cold. I called for the assistant. Moved the kids into an activity. Then I sat with Alina until she came back, slowly, blinking, breathing like she'd just run a mile. She didn't cry. She just looked at me and said, "I think I broke something." And she was right. She left that day and never came back. Her key was found in her cubby. Her desk was cleared the next morning. No exit interview. No call from management. Just a new job posting online the next week. Like she'd never been there at all. And I think that's what got to me the most. Not the fact that she had a breakdown. Not even that no one noticed it coming. But that when she left, the system didn't pause. It just kept moving. We had a meeting about who would take over the pre-K class. Talked about ratios, coverage, which parents needed to be reassured. But no one said her name. No one said, maybe we failed her. No one said, maybe this is what happens when we keep pretending everything's fine. And sitting in that meeting, listening to the director talk about maintaining our professional image, I realized that would be me soon. Unless I left first. Because here's what most people don't understand. Preschool teachers don't leave because they don't care. They leave because they do. Because caring in a system like this will eat you alive. We don't get hazard pay, even though we deal with biohazards almost daily: vomit, blood, feces, lice outbreaks. We don't get mental health days, even though our job requires emotional regulation 24/7. We don't get prep time, even though we're expected to develop differentiated lesson plans for a room full of children who are all functioning at wildly different levels. We're told to be educators, caregivers, nurses, conflict resolution experts, janitors, entertainers, and mandated reporters. All while making less than the teenager working drive-thru at Chick-fil-A. And we're told that if we really love kids, we won't complain. But love isn't enough. Not when the cost is your sanity. Not when your love is weaponized against you. That day, the day Alina left, I went home, sat on my couch, and stared at the wall for 3 hours. I didn't eat. I didn't move. Because it hit me. I wasn't burning out. I was already burnt. There was nothing left to give. And worse, I was starting to believe that what happened to her was normal. That it was just part of the job. That's how they get you, you know. They convince you that your suffering is noble. That your breakdown is a rite of passage. That your silence means you're strong. But it's a lie. All of it. And once I saw that lie for what it was, there was no going back. So I made a decision. And it changed everything. Not because it fixed the system, but because it was the first time I chose me. That's what I'll tell you next. I didn't leave with a plan. There was no dramatic confrontation, no last day celebration, no bittersweet slideshow of memories. Just an email. I wrote it late one night in the glow of my kitchen light, fingers trembling, stomach sick, heart pounding. It took me 3 hours to write 2 paragraphs. No rage. No accusations. Just the bare minimum of professionalism. I said I needed to step away for personal reasons. That I appreciated the opportunity. That my last day would be Friday. I expected to feel relief when I hit send. I didn't. I just felt hollow. And when Friday came, I packed my things after the kids were gone, silently, methodically. A few personal books. A sweater I'd kept on the back of my chair. A sticky note with a child's crayon drawing and my name scribbled in 4 colors. No one said goodbye. No one asked where I was going. They were short-staffed. Busy. The room kept moving. And that's the thing. You can give years of your life, your body, your soul to a job like that, and when you walk away, it's like pulling your hand out of water. The space you leave behind closes up instantly. Like you were never there at all. At first, I thought I'd rest. Maybe read. Maybe sleep. Maybe breathe. But what no one tells you is that when you finally stop, everything you've been pushing down rises up all at once. The guilt. The memories. The faces. It hit me hardest at 10 a.m. That was when we used to have circle time. Every day, I'd sit in that tiny chair, singing that same welcome song, asking the kids how they were feeling, pretending not to be tired or anxious or on the verge of tears. After I left, I'd find myself staring at the clock, wondering what they were doing. Who was there? If anyone remembered I was gone. The answer was probably no. Children move on fast. That's how they survive. But I didn't. I started having dreams. The kind where a child is crying and I can't reach them. Or where I'm the one crying and no one notices. Once, I dreamed I was back in the classroom and the walls were closing in. The cubbies got smaller. The lights flickered. And when I opened the art supply closet, it was empty. Just rows and rows of empty bins. That's what burnout feels like after the fact. Not fire. Not destruction. Emptiness. I tried to talk about it with friends, with family. But it's hard to explain what this kind of work does to you without sounding ungrateful or dramatic or weak. People say things like, "Oh, but the kids must have loved you." Or, "I could never do that job, you're a saint." Or, "Well, at least you made a difference." But they don't understand. They never saw the bruises. The lice combs. The diapers so full they sagged to the knees. The 3-year-olds with night terrors. The 5-year-olds who flinched when their name was called. They didn't see the times we had to whisper into the phone to Child Protective Services on our lunch break, praying no one overheard. They didn't see the mold in the nap mats, or the outdated medication forms, or the food that came in bulk boxes marked not for resale. They didn't see how the youngest and most vulnerable in our society were being cared for by a system that runs on exhaustion, silence, and fear. But I did. And now I can't unsee it. Even now, months after I walked away, I find myself scanning every news headline about childcare, every new policy announcement, every feel-good story with smiling toddlers and finger paint. Because I know what's happening behind those photos. I know how many teachers are breaking quietly. I know how many kids are slipping through the cracks. I know how many centers fudge the numbers, ignore the red flags, rewrite the narrative. And worst of all, I know how easy it is to convince yourself that it's just you. That you're the problem. That if you were stronger, better, more patient, more creative, more resilient, the system wouldn't have chewed you up and spit you out. But it's not just you. It never was. It's all of us. All of us who came in with open hearts and left carrying a kind of grief no one warned us about. And now, on the other side of it, I finally see the truth. This system isn't broken. It was built this way. Built to extract everything it can from the people doing the hardest, most essential work, while giving them just enough to keep showing up. Built to survive on illusion. On smiles. On cute crafts taped to the windows, even as children scream behind closed doors. And until we stop pretending, until we say it out loud, nothing will change. I don't have a solution. I'm not here to fix it. I just needed to tell the truth. Even if no one listens. Even if it changes nothing. Because silence is what keeps it alive. And I've been silent long enough. But there's still one last thing I want to say. To the parents. To the people who think this doesn't affect them. To the ones who've never stepped into a classroom but drop off their child every morning, expecting everything to be fine. That's who I want to speak to next. If you've made it this far, thank you. I don't take that lightly. Because I know this hasn't been easy to hear. It wasn't easy to live either. I spent years in those classrooms. Years smiling through exhaustion, holding children who screamed in my arms, scrubbing messes off the floor while pretending everything was fine. Years giving everything I had and still feeling like it was never enough. And now that I'm out of it, now that I've had time to breathe, to think, to really sit with everything I saw, there's one thing I keep coming back to. How easy it is to believe in the illusion. How easy it is to trust a system that looks warm, structured, nurturing, even when the foundation is cracked. Because most people don't see what we see. They don't hear what we hear. They don't sit on the floor with a child who hasn't eaten in 2 days and pretend snack time is just part of the routine. They don't hold a trembling child while filing a silent CPS report, knowing full well that nothing might come of it. They don't walk out of a room and cry in the janitor's closet, only to wipe their face and go back in like nothing happened. But I did. We did. So many of us. And that's why I had to tell this story. Not because I think I'm special. Not because I want pity. But because I'm not alone and neither are you. If you're a parent, ask yourself, when's the last time you really asked your child's teacher how they're doing? Not what your child ate for lunch or how many tantrums they had, how the teacher is doing. Because I promise you, if you've got a good one, they're holding more than you know. If you're a teacher, you don't have to carry it all by yourself. And you're not a failure for feeling broken. You're operating in a system that's designed to stretch you thin, to make you question your worth, to keep you silent under the weight of professionalism. But your pain is real. Your burnout is valid. And your leaving does not mean you didn't care. Sometimes it means you cared too much. And if you're just someone listening, someone who never thought about what happens in those bright-colored classrooms behind the locked glass doors, I hope this made you think. Even just a little. Because this isn't just about one center, one teacher, one bad experience. It's about a structure. A reality that most people are too busy, too trusting, or too far removed to notice. And that's how it survives. Because we assume care is happening behind the scenes. Because we want to believe our kids are safe. Because it's easier to believe that everything is fine. But here's the truth. Safety doesn't come from cute murals and learning apps and laminated behavior charts. It comes from people. From human beings who are trained, supported, and seen. And right now, that's not happening. So I'll leave you with this. What do you really know about the place you send your child to every day? What do you assume is happening? And what might be happening when you're not looking? Have you ever worked in early childhood education or known someone who has? What did they tell you? Did they ever open up, or were they too afraid to? If you're a parent, what kind of questions do you ask when you tour a center? What red flags have you missed, only to notice too late? I want to hear from you. Not because I have the answers, but because I think we've been quiet about this for too long. So if this resonated with you, please share your story. In the comments. In a message. With a friend. Say the thing no one else is saying. Because silence is the soil this broken system grows in. And the only way it changes is if we stop pretending not to see it. So now I'm asking you. Do you see it now?